Hello, my name is Rebecca Brett Harris. I'm a researcher and secondary English teacher at Alpha School in Swansea. Today I'd like to share my findings and practices with you about whole class feedback and how it can possibly be integrated and utilised within the classroom and actually have a positive influence on reducing your marking workload. When the guidance and information for Curriculum for Wales was released, formative assessment featured strongly as part of it. However, this did seem to highlight that there was still a disparity between teachers' understanding of summative and formative assessment, as well as marking and feedback. We often conflate the two, which frequently leads to burnt-out teachers marking until all hours and still not feeling that they're making a difference to their pupils. As part of my research role, I was asked to research whole class feedback, as it appeared to be having an impact in schools and was being widely talked about. I was quite intrigued to hear and read about schools who had no marking policies and how they were using whole class feedback to benefit pupils and teachers alike. Before embarking into whole class feedback fully, I researched feedback and felt that Hatterley and Timperley's 3 questions of where am I going, how am I going, and where to next were an effective way into looking at the way we look at feedback. I would often see marking disguised as feedback, and I felt it was important to show the difference between the two. Yes, we should reduce the amount of marking we do, but it shouldn't be at the cost of valuable feedback. So the big question is, how do we give feedback and reduce marking? Well, focusing on formative assessment for feedback, I think, is key. As Professor Dylan William points out, marking and feedback are different, and feedback should improve the pupil and not the work. So for me, this was not necessarily new information, but it did have a huge impact on my mindset, and I wanted to know if feedback could be given efficiently and effectively. Personally, I've previously felt that good feedback on pupils' books means using feedback sheets, very long comments, detailed annotations, basically hours of writing targets and improvements over and over again, and book after book. The longer it takes, the better the feedback, right? Well, unfortunately, those of us who went through that rigmarole soon realised that this was unsustainable, unrealistic, and pupils never really paid more than 5 minutes attention to what you had written. It was soul-destroying, and yet this is what seemed to be the norm and what was expected by our managers, our parents, and even our students. So in order to shift these perceptions and try to have a positive impact on teachers and pupils, I think it's important to understand, 1, the difference between summative and formative feedback. There's still notion to put targets on summative work, which at times can be helpful, but it should only be done if it's going to improve the pupil. Number 2, we need to think about what formative work we should look at. I find that looking at and feeding back on pupils' drafts or their plans is by far more beneficial to pupils than telling them what they should have done when there's no chance of them going and doing it again. And 3, how to feedback, because it doesn't have to take hours, nor does it have to be written down in 3 different ways with responses in all different colours, because really, who does that benefit? So whole class feedback is an effective way of allowing us to feedback effectively and in a timely fashion. One part of whole class feedback that I chose not to use were the whole class feedback sheets. Now I know these have had lots of success from many people, but for me, these sheets with the boxes on that you make notes and then share with the class, I didn't think were going to work for me. I did trial it, and on one trial, I shared the sheet with the pupils, printed it out, they stuck it in, but it didn't serve any other purpose than a sheet stuck into their book. I felt it was still taking me longer to produce the sheet than it was actually benefiting the pupils' learning. I was also never fully comfortable with writing the names of star pupils or the best work, and then writing down those who were missing their work, because I felt that that would have a negative impact on motivation, and it would distract from the actual feedback I was trying to produce. Pupils would be too involved in looking for names and not on the actual improvements I wanted them to make. There could also be a GDPR issue here with this, as some students' absences call for confidentiality. So after trialling it, I decided the sheets wouldn't work for me, nor would I use pupils' names publicly in the feedback. So instead, I decided to integrate feedback onto PowerPoint and use a range of strategies to feed this back to pupils. So using examples of whole class feedback from a number of teacher blogs from prominent teachers on Twitter, I've chosen 5 feedback strategies to use as part of my lessons. These are reteach the concept, set an improvement task, use of coded marking instead of writing feedback in full, modelling, and verbal feedback. So after marking work, I aim to feedback as closely as I can to that lesson, ideally in the next lesson where possible. On the work itself, pupils will have acknowledgement marking, which will consist of ticks, my signature, and the date. I might even include some coded marking at this point and point out spelling, punctuation errors, or possible misinterpretations. And pupils will either know the meanings for these codes, or I can display them on the board for them. So by condensing down this marking, it means I can get through a set of work, make notes on strengths and weaknesses in about an hour and a half. Rather than when you factor in the individual marking of a set of books, which can take in excess of 3 hours. So you're already gaining time from doing it this way. It is then in the lesson that I start drilling down into the issues that arose. This is kind of how it would look in my classroom through the PowerPoint. I'll always share strengths to begin with. As I'd marked the work not that long before, I find that I can reference examples from students' work without actually naming the students. So for example, I might say something like, oh, I was really pleased to see the use of personification in your work. And there was a really lovely example where someone showed the sea being personified as a relentless warrior. You can then catch the eye of that pupil and show them that you have a clear knowledge of the work that was produced. You're still keeping those relationships with the pupils and saying to them, I know you and I know your work. So the more you can pull that in, and it might be a scripted piece that you keep in front of you, that you keep and don't show the pupils, it's a really nice way of showing your pupils that you've read their work and you do know what they've included. So following off strengths, I then show the weakness. I don't really want to bombard pupils at this point, so I try and aim for a maximum of 3 things to work on in that time and try to make one a skill and one a content. The 5 strategies I use are interchangeable, and they can be amalgamated to help you deliver the feedback effectively. Previously, and what seems to be becoming a strategy for me, is that I use modelling to show a common error, followed by reteach the concept to show how to avoid this error, and then set an improvement task to make the correction. Depending on the task, it can take somewhere between 5 minutes to a whole lesson. Just saying, look at this example, what error can you see? This is how you avoid it. Now I'm going to give you 3 minutes to go back in your books to see if you've made that error and make the correction. It doesn't have to be onerous or a hugely long task, because if you're focusing on improving the learners to be better next time, then it's time well spent. When first looking into whole class feedback, I was under the impression that it was something that happened at the start of a lesson to respond to a piece of work that pupils had completed. I've come to realise that there's so much more flexibility with this now, and it can be used at any point of the lesson to support and move the learners forward. One aspect that needs to be given to feedback is time, but not necessarily more time or lots of time. It can be a 10-minute intervention that reteaches a skill and allows pupils a chance to improve the work they've completed. It could be a 3-minute conversation with a learner that is then shared verbally with the whole class to allow those who are potentially making similar errors a chance to put it right. It doesn't need to be a prescriptive list of skills that need to be taught and improved, but instead a holistic approach to communicating with our pupils and helping them improve. So when I say it needs to be invested in, I think the mindset needs to change from how long is this going to take me to how can I use this in a lesson and when? Providing more timely feedback has meant that I can intervene with the learning and prevent pupils embedding misconceptions and repeating their errors. Planning is key with this element of feedback, but it doesn't have to be onerous. As you get to know your classes and your subject, you'll sometimes be able to predict the errors that are most likely to come up. This might seem unlikely, but you'll soon realise within a few books and examples what kind of errors the pupils are making. It shows itself to you quite quickly. It also means that it also might lead to some errors being repeated across key stages. They might come up more than once in that year. So you'll actually find you start having a store of activities that can be used across key stages and also throughout the year to help address these problems. So if anything, whole class feedback has allowed me to refine and hone skills with pupils in a timely and supportive manner that instills confidence with them as they revisit problems. Moving forward, I'm looking at using whole class feedback in asynchronous settings, as I believe it can still be utilised, and as an effective tool in blended and remote learning. So far, I've created feedback looms based on submitted work. I've used and shared reflection sheets with pupils, and I've looked at intervening during drafts, where I've created a document where they can write up a section of their draft so far. I can then feedback on that and try to help them avoid any errors for their final summative task. The main takeaway I have with all of this is that my marking feels effective, but it's not impinging on my time at all, which is win-win. So that's how I've been able to use whole class feedback, and I highly recommend you try it too. Thank you very much for your time.